Okay, so welcome to this first video on the English Language and Literature section of my channel. Now the first thing we're going to look at is Shakespeare. Now obviously any student at GCSE level will be studying a Shakespeare text. It's usually Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, but sometimes others crop up like Merchant of Venice, one or two others as well. So what I thought I would do here in this video is just to set the scene for the work of Shakespeare. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at his own biography. I'm going to kind of note down key points. So I'm at a site called shakespeare.org.uk. This is a really good site. I've just been having a look through it. There are a number of different books and biographies of Shakespeare you can take a look at. Let me see if I can find them up here. I've got this one here, which is quite a nice one. Amazing and Extraordinary Facts About Shakespeare. That has some quite interesting, quirky facts about his life and also many other things as well. And then there's also an excellent book called Shakespeare's England. This is the one I draw from a lot actually in my classes because it gives us a historical backdrop as well. So I'm going to be drawing from those two a little bit as well as looking at this text here. So the first thing I just want to establish here in this video is that it's worthwhile looking at his life. We want to look at his individual life, his individual biography. We also want to look at the historical backdrop of Shakespeare's England and the kind of political backdrop as well, which kind of comes off as a kind of offshoot of that. And then we finally do maybe want to consider the artistic and literary backdrop as well. This pen's been a little bit skinny here. Let's see if I can just get a slightly bigger nib on the width there. Okay, so those are the things that we're going to look at here in this video. So we're going to first of all take a look at Shakespeare's life, his own biography. There was a period in literary criticism in which the kind of dominant school of thought was that you shouldn't really look too much at an author's life. You should just focus on their work. Forget about their life. And there was a French critic, Roland Barthes, who famously wrote, "The author is dead." I think thankfully that school of thought is more or less kind of died out now in criticism. It was kind of self-evidently ridiculous, in all honesty. And I don't really know how it took hold, but it did for a period of time. But actually now there is a lot of scholarship looking at authors' lives and how their lives intersect and relate to their own text. So it's very important that we do look at it. So just going to this site here, we have just a few key details of Shakespeare. So he's born in 1564 and we think that he died on his birthday on the 23rd of April, 1616. So he lived to the grand old age of 52, which was considered obviously a moderate age in Jacobean England. But it was still a slightly shortened life. No one really knows what he died of. The report of death, it seems likely that he probably died of peritonitis, possibly a burst appendix, but that's kind of speculation. It could equally have been something else. But he died quite quickly over a period of 3 or 4 days, was taken sick, was febrile, and died in a few days. By that point, he was a very wealthy and successful man and had retired back to his hometown, which is Stratford upon Avon. So where do we have this? Here. So we go down to his family life here. So Shakespeare was the son of a glover, a glove maker, John Shakespeare, and he was a significant figure, as it says here, in the town of Stratford, which was a market town. It still to this day is a very picturesque historical town. Obviously now very much kind of dominated by the memory of William Shakespeare. But if you ever have the chance to, it's a very nice town to visit. Okay, so in terms of Shakespeare's own education, so as Shakespeare's father was a man of means, he had some money, he could afford to have his son educated. And he was educated in what we might describe today in a kind of Renaissance style of education. And so I won't go into all of the history of the Renaissance right here, but the Renaissance, meaning rebirth, is basically a rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman texts, art forms, science, political structures, and so on. And this kind of began in Italy in the 1400s, and it spread right through Europe. And the reason really was that much of this material had been lost, and when it was kind of rediscovered, the response was, oh wow, 1,000 years ago, ancient Greece was, 1,000 years ago, Greece was further ahead than Europe was in the 1300s, and the same with Rome and so on. So kind of made people think, and the education system kind of just decided, right, we're going to focus on Greek and Roman. So Shakespeare would have been very well versed in Latin, probably wrote it fluently, and would have been really saturated in Greek, Roman mythology, history, and so on and so forth. So that was really what the education was based on. The basic idea was, these civilizations were the pinnacle of these civilizations were the pinnacle in human history. So we're going to kind of teach our young about them and hope they can kind of take the mantle on from there. And actually that more or less happened, to be honest, because it wasn't just art forms and so on, it was also maths as well. Euclidean maths, which comes from Greek, trigonometry, algebra, and all the rest of it. So that was Shakespeare's education. So he would have been very well educated for his time. And if you study Shakespeare's prose, so his writing style, it is highly Latinate, I would say. It uses a lot of vocab that comes from Latin, and it also uses quite flexible Latinate constructions, which are unusual in English. And I think that flexibility is something that allowed Shakespeare such an incredible expression. So he has a lot to kind of credit to his early education. So we will pick up his biography from here. So William Shakespeare would have lived with his family in their house in Henley Street until he turned 18. So when he was 18, he married Anne Hathaway, who was 26. It was a rushed marriage because Anne was already pregnant at the time of the ceremony. It was maybe somewhat scandalous that young Shakespeare was getting married to a woman 8 years his senior, which would probably have been quite unusual at the time. So quite a sort of precocious beginning to his adult life. And he went on to have 2 other children as well. But small town life really wasn't for Shakespeare. And he basically upped and left around about the age of 21, 22, I believe it was. I wonder if we can get a reference here. Yeah, early 20s. And went to London. And we call this period between his early 20s and around about 30 the lost years. There's even been a film called Shakespeare in Love, which was all about these lost years. It's a good film, actually, but in reality we don't know a great deal about those times. There's a couple of documents. I think one of them is something like a fine or some kind of sanction for hunting on somebody else's land. And then another one I think is just a bill or an unpaid bill or an unpaid like rental agreement, something along those lines. So there's a bit of documentation, but not really very much. So we're kind of left to speculate on that period of his life. I have my own ideas about it. Okay, so the lost years, essentially Shakespeare's 20s. We have no idea really what happened to him and what he was doing. I would speculate that he was probably reading quite widely during that time, and that his life was probably not a calm, conservative, placid life. I think he was exposed to a lot. I think he probably ran around with some of the kind of burgeoning early theatre people in London, and all of the kind of waifs and strays that kind of associate with that particular profession at that time. So I think he probably had quite a colourful time. And the reason I suggest that is because I don't think you can write with his piercing understanding of human nature at a time which, we should remember is pre any concept of kind of psychology, psychoanalysis, neurology, sociology, anything even like that. And he wrote with such amazing finesse and insight about these things that it makes me think really he must have had quite an interesting, colourful life. So that's my speculation. I could be completely wrong, but it's just my own speculation. So this is Shakespeare's early life, and we basically see some printed works in the early 1590s, and he also founds a theatre company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men as well. So just a very brief word on the theatre at this particular point. So if you go back much further into history, we look at Greek tragedy, drama and comedy and so on. There was a period of time where theatre and acting was an important or an interesting and significant part of civilization. But really throughout the Middle Ages and up to more or less up to the life of Shakespeare, in England and also largely throughout Europe as well, theatre as we kind of know it today was just non-existent. Actors were considered really the lowest of the low. They were on a kind of similar level as to maybe a homeless tramp or a prostitute, something along those lines. They were considered kind of social outsiders. And the reason for this was because they travelled from town to town. They just kind of put on a little show and then moved on to the next town, just made a few coins, had their dinner, had a few drinks, and then just kind of moved on. And it wasn't seen as a very kind of wholesome life, particularly in a period which was dominated by church and religious doctrine as well. And it's really within Shakespeare's lifetime that respectability began to be conferred on theatre itself. So Shakespeare is a hugely significant figure in the development of theatre in this country. Now, there were other important figures in this period of time who played a very significant part in the kind of establishment of theatre as a real art form, something respectable within England. One of them was Christopher Marlowe, and the other was Ben Jonson as well. So those were a couple of contemporaries of William Shakespeare, but I think it's fair to say that Shakespeare was really one of the kind of figureheads, not only as a playwright, but also as a business person as well, actually establishing his own theatre. So, first of all, Shakespeare established the Lord Chamberlain's Men. This was under the Elizabethan reign, and this was, and so the company began during Elizabethan England, which was a tremendous growth period for England. I'm going to come to that in a moment. And when Elizabeth died and King James took over in, I think it was 1604, 1605, let me just double check, 1603. When Elizabeth died and James took over, Shakespeare got what was effectively like the ultimate sponsorship, the royal sponsorship, and his company came to be known as the King's Men. This is really the ultimate, for that period of time. It's like I suppose, like if you think of an athlete or something, if they were sponsored by Nike, that must mean they were pretty good. And this is maybe a similar thing, probably more significant really. So he was sponsored by the King's Men. Sorry, he was sponsored by King James. So this is really the ultimate recognition. So the art form's gone from vagabonds, tramps, lowlives, to sponsorship and patronage by the King of England, one of the most powerful men in the world. So Shakespeare really was a success within his own lifetime. So he wasn't one of these artists like a Van Gogh or certain other writers who appreciated more after they lived. Shakespeare was hugely successful within his own lifetime. And during the kind of second phase of his career, after this kind of sponsorship by King James, some of these really significant texts were written. King Lear, Macbeth, and The Tempest as well. This history really plays into Macbeth, and it's something I will look at when I do a video specifically on Macbeth. So Shakespeare was tremendously prolific, 38 plays, 2 narrative poems, 154 sonnets. Okay, I don't know if you've ever tried to write a play. It's not easy, and Shakespeare wrote 38 of them to a tremendously visionary standard. Interestingly, if you actually look at the scripts themselves, there isn't much in the way of kind of scribbling out. So he really writes in a very fluid way. You can see it just in his handwriting. He just kind of knew what he wanted to write, and it was in his vision and his prose and his kind of ability with language allowed him to execute. So it's kind of enviable, actually, that most people, when they write an email, they have to go back and delete things and write it again, but Shakespeare was just able to write in this very fluid way. So towards the end of his life, after he had had all of this success, he retired to Stratford upon Avon, probably in his kind of mid-40s, and spent the rest of his life there. What else do we have? Shakespeare died in Stratford on the 23rd of April 1616 at the age of 52. So that's the day when Miguel de Cervantes, really the first novelist, the father of the novel form, died. He was over in Madrid in Spain. So this was a powerful time for Europe as well. It wasn't just England that this kind of cultural progress and this kind of golden age for the arts was happening. It was actually happening in other places, but specifically Spain, actually, at this particular period in time. And there's a few funny things about Shakespeare after his death. In his will, it specifies that he only left like a tin bed to his wife, and he left all the rest to his children. And some people have said, is this a slight? Did he dislike his wife? Did they not get on? I'm not sure. My understanding is that actually a little bit too much is made of that, because it's taken as a given that legally she would inherit the premises, so he didn't really need to even incorporate her into the will. So the aftermath of Shakespeare's life is obviously, his work has really never been out of print and performance, which I believe is probably unique. So for the last nearly 500 years, he's been performed somewhere, probably every day, every week, certainly every week. And there's no signs that the industry of Shakespeare is about to slow down. So he is the most widely performed writer on planet Earth by a huge margin. A huge margin. No one else really gets anywhere near. So a hugely significant cultural figure, not only in England, also overseas, all over the world as well. Interestingly, he wasn't really appreciated very much on the continent. England was seen as a little bit backward. I'm going to come to this in a moment. It wasn't really appreciated in the rest of Europe until interestingly, he wasn't so well received around Europe for quite a period of time. So other kind of Enlightenment, kind of rationalist figures from around Europe weren't so impressed with Shakespeare for the first kind of couple hundred years, really. So Voltaire famously described his work as the mad ravings of a drunk, something along those lines. So he wasn't really impressed with Shakespeare. But actually crucial to Shakespeare's reputation around Europe culturally was his reception by Victor Hugo, who was a French writer, one of the more famous French writers who wrote Les Miserables. So he's this kind of social realist writer, writing about the down and out, downtrodden people in Paris, which is frankly the majority of people in Paris at this particular time, and also famously the Hunchback of Notre Dame as well. And he had a tremendous admiration for Shakespeare and kind of championed Shakespeare's work in France. And this actually did wonders for Shakespeare's reputation in France. I think it was significant that this kind of other culturally tremendously powerful civilization, culture in France also began to adopt and champion Shakespeare. And at kind of that point, it's really a done deal at that point. So Victor Hugo was key in Shakespeare's kind of growing reputation over the centuries, spreading kind of from the Anglophone world into the French-speaking world as well, and obviously well beyond that at this point. So I've looked this up in the past, how many works of Shakespeare are performed on a daily basis around the world. I mean obviously now we're in coronavirus, so there are probably no performances, but in a typical year, around about 30 performances per day somewhere in the world, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. You know, out of Shakespeare's 40-odd plays, there are 30 performances every single day somewhere in the world. You know, probably half a dozen or so in England, same in the US, and then the rest just scattered in every single country in the world. And it's an incredible thing when you think that one artist has had that much of an impact. It's really amazing. Okay, so this video has already got fairly long at this point, but I think I've, I would say, introduced Shakespeare's life more than anything at this point. What we're going to do in the next video is I'm going to do a little bit more on this kind of backdrop and this background material. We're going to look at the historical, political, and a little bit of the artistic and literary backdrop to Shakespeare's life. And that will hopefully really give you a good grounding in what's going on, what's happening at this particular point in time. So I'll catch you in the next video, and we will continue the journey in there.